it is entirely reasonable to hold to the position, as Aquinas does, that the first sin of man could only have been the cause of original sin. And Aquinas demonstrates this with multiple statements in chapter 186 of the Compendium. Indeed, in the first paragraph, he asserts that because man's lower powers were subject to reason without any rebelliousness, and man's reason itself was subject to God, consequently, neither death nor illness had any place in man. Now, this is an indication that man was not created to rebel, and consequently, the fact that he did rebel would seem to be pretty substantial proof that the first act which brought about the fall was the only way to original sin. However, we must be very careful to remind ourselves that man was created with free will. And part of that freedom that God gave him was the capacity to choose against the good, was to choose evil, which evil being a deprivation of good, as Aquinas demonstrates elsewhere. And by choosing, by deviating from the good, from our essence and our purpose for communion with God, man therefore has the capacity to choose evil, to choose the deprivation. This is to say, by virtue of his essence, a human being is supposed to be good. But also part of our essence is the freedom through which the deviation from the essential attribute of goodness is possible. So where does this leave us with original sin? The original sin that every human being inherits at the moment of his or her conception is, of course, a result of that initial rebellious act committed by our first parents. It is therefore a consequence of who we are rather than what we have done. Adam and Eve, on the other hand, had original sin because of the consequence of what they did. Had they not sinned, the freedom to do so would still be potential but not actual until it was committed through a conscious act of the will. Therefore, Aquinas' position that original sin could only come through the first act is entirely reasonable to hold because it incorporates a true understanding of both free will and how that freedom relates to the essence of what it means to be human. Now, it's important to understand here, to give a little bit of background, Aquinas elsewhere says that he argues that the incarnation would not have happened had original sin not happened. Now, that I think is very telling as it relates to this question, because Christ is the new Adam, and he comes to free mankind from the consequences of the sin that Adam brought about. So it's hardly a coincidence that Aquinas argues that original sin would not have come about without that first act of rebellion. Whether that had been with Adam and Eve, or, even somebody nowadays, going on down through generations, we don't know. But it was that first act that happened to be committed by the first parents, that deviation from their free will, that brought about original sin. And that is why in baptism, of course, is a washing away of the original sin. But I found it very interesting that Aquinas argues that the incarnation was contingent, the necessity of the incarnation was contingent upon original sin and the first act of rebellion, whereas St. Bonaventure and John Duns Scotus argue the opposite. So anyways, the position of Aquinas that original sin was brought about by the first act and only so is entirely reasonable to hold in light of the weight of the evidence that has been presented here. Thank you very much.